Joining us now, acclaimed author, Sports Illustrated contributor, and friend of BYU Sports Nation, Jeff Benedict. Jeff, you've hit the ground running today with this article that you released, this excerpt called 10,000 Spirals featuring Steve Young. Are you surviving the social media frenzy thus far?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, Steve's made, I think, so many friends over the years in the media business that back from his early playing days, I think he's always had great relationships with the people who write about the game and about him. And so a lot of those guys this morning who saw the excerpt have been tweeting it around, and universally, I think they all love it because a lot of these guys used to cover him when he was a player. So it's been great.
New York Times bestselling author Jeff Benedict on BYU Sports Nation. Jeff, how did this entire venture start? How did this project even get going with Steve Young?
I was going to say kind of accidentally, but a couple years ago when I was doing the initial cover story on Jabari Parker for Sports Illustrated, the magazine, when they realized, Jabari was going to have to deal with the question of whether to serve a mission or not, we were kind of halfway through the profile, and the managing editor of Sports Illustrated said to me, we really need a sidebar in the magazine about that question. Let's look at other great Mormon athletes who've had to deal with the question and look at how they handled it. And they specifically said, we'd like you to interview Steve Young and Danny Ainge because neither of them went, and then maybe a couple other guys who did go. And so I called Steve. I'd never met Steve at that point in my life. I'd never talked to him. And I called him as an SI writer to request, an interview with him about the question of his mission. And we had a very long, interesting conversation about it. And at the end of that call, he asked me, he said he'd been meaning to call me. And he asked me if I would be interested in helping him research and write his life history for his family. It's something that he'd been thinking about for a long time, and I've been hired to do that for other people before. And so naturally I was intrigued. I'd always admired Steve. We're both from Connecticut. And so I was interested, and that's kind of how it started. It started very slow and very simply, and I just started working on it. At his request, he put me in touch with some of his former teammates and coaches from college and the 49ers and the LA Express, and we just started plodding along. That's how it began.
Jeff, we were reading through the blog, and there's a part of it where Steve talks about, I think he uses the word insecurity, and Spencer and I were talking about that Steve is such a driven athlete, and part of that drive may come from the fact that underlying there's this great humility that is in Steve and a little bit of insecurity about never feeling like he's arrived. You've spent time with him now where certainly he has arrived. I mean, everybody knows who Steve Young is. He's a Hall of Famer.
Sure.
As you have a chance to interact with him on a regular basis, is that humility and that insecurity still there? Do you see that? And does that still drive him in the things that he does today?
Well, here's the thing I think that's really, really fascinating. I'm going to take you back to a conversation I had with him in a hotel room, early on in this process. So when we started going, and I was basically meeting him on Mondays when he'd come east for Monday night games, and I'd interview him and stuff. And I read a lot of books about other sports memoirs and biographies, and I read some stuff on Joe DiMaggio. And one time, years ago, Joe DiMaggio said, there's a reason that rich kids never make it in the big leagues. It's because they're not hungry, and they've never been hungry. And I read that quote to Steve one day, and I asked him what he thought about that, because, Steve could be described as the person who kind of breaks that quote, because he's from Greenwich, Connecticut, the richest zip code in the U.S., And so I asked him about it, and we got into a big conversation about what drives him. And humility usually isn't a thing that drives great athletes. If you think about what it takes to be a great athlete, it's these are aggressive physical games where it's very macho and very tough, and humility doesn't usually come in. But in Steve's case, I think one of the things that is really fascinating is that he has genuine humility. Like, he's always had it since he was little. He still has it today. And I think that's what allowed him to get around that kind of Joe DiMaggio quote, which is a pretty true statement. But Steve had other things working in his life that were pushing him or motivating him to excel the way he did. And I think that's what makes him such a fascinating character in sports history.
You know, so there's that combination of this humility, insecurity, whatever you want to call it. I don't know what the best word for it is. You're a better wordsmith than I am, Jeff, but he's got that going for him. But he's this fiercely competitive. Those of us that played with him and stood by his side for a number of years, that combination, that competitive nature, is the combination I think made him as good as he was. Does he still have that edge about him? I don't get to spend time with him anymore, and you've had some time. Is he as competitive
Sure.
as ever? I mean, he wouldn't let you win in checkers back in the day.
No, I mean, I think, obviously we all change as we age, you know what I mean? And I'm almost 50, and Steve's still a little bit over 50. And I think when you reach the point where both of us are at in our lives, you do change. I mean, you get married, you have children, all of those things change your perspective and your approach. And Steve's not a professional athlete anymore. You know, he does other things in his life now. But I think the parts of him that are traits, that are what I call character traits, those are always going to be in him, just like mine are always going to be in me. And I'm sure that if you put him on a field for a flag football game, you'd want to win. You know, he'd want to outrace the guy to the goal line. He would want to throw the best pass. I mean, I think that's just part of his nature.
Jeff Benedict, award-winning author, joining us on BYU Sports Nation. I want to quote something from your excerpt that I was just kind of flabbergasted about, and that is that Steve Young admitted that he has an anxiety-ridden side. He said, "There are two sides to me, the anxiety-ridden side, which often fills me with fear when I most need to be at my best. This is the part of me that I don't want anyone to know about." How did you sum that up when he told you about that? Was it hard for you to believe? Because that one caught me entirely off guard, Jeff.
Well, one of the things about this is just more about the process, but in writing something like this, you have to sum it up. You can't just go on and blather on about these things. And so part of the trick is to get these thoughts and these memories into a succinct narrative, and that's basically that's why he asked me to help. You know, that's what we're trying to do. And I think to me that's one of the most fascinating things about him, is because I often say this, courage isn't being exempt from fear. Courage is having fear and being willing to face it.
As being able to manage it.
And I think that's why I think we tend to be a little too quick when we call athletes courageous or heroes, because a lot of times we're saying that because they do athletic things on the field. They're fast, they're strong, they make great catches, they make dunks. That's not courageous, though. That's not. What is courageous, on the other hand, is individuals who do have fears, and they face them and move on. And I mean, if you think of Steve's stories, I mean, coming to BYU and succeeding Jim McMahon, arguably the greatest quarterback in college history up to that point. I mean, who wants to go after him? But that's nothing compared to going to San Francisco and coming after Joe Montana. I mean, that's like times 10. And I think if you look at the trajectory of his football life, it is story after story about things like that most athletes, no matter how great their athletic talent is, would not be able to hold up under those circumstances. He does. He doesn't do it once. He does it habitually. And I think that's what makes him the great player. I mean, he is a self-made Hall of Fame athlete. Sure, he had great abilities. We all know that. But as he says in this chapter today, I mean, this is a guy, when he got to BYU, didn't really know how to throw a football, didn't really know how to backpedal and do three-step drops and stuff like that. He had to teach himself how to do those things. And most guys, I think, would have withered away at that point.
Jeff, we're all jealous of what you get to do, and I know it's a job as a writer, but this had to be a fun project and continues to be a fun project. What's it been like to visit with Steve on a regular basis, to get to know him intimately and to be able to go through these kinds of thoughts with him? Tell us about this process and how much you've enjoyed it.
Well, I've enjoyed it immensely. I mean, it's been about 2.5 years or so, not steady, obviously, but, we first met when I did the Jabari piece, so that was 2.5 years ago. And I think that, one of the things that it's enabled me to do, which has been, kind of a great fringe benefit, was I grew up in Connecticut. I was the only Mormon in my school. I lived just up the coast from where Steve grew up. And he was a few years older than me. So when I was a high school kid, he was an All-American at BYU. And at that time, in the early 80s, where I lived in Connecticut, having somebody like him doing what he was doing made my life easier. And that was the case when he became a pro. And so when I've worked on this, I mean, one of the things I've done is I never got to see Steve play in person when he was a pro. But what I've been doing today, or the last couple of years, is following him to NFL stadiums when he does Monday night games. And it's been fascinating to walk into these stadiums, even though he's been away from the game now for 14 years. When he walks into a stadium on a Monday afternoon, and it's mostly empty at that point except the custodians and the grounds crew, everybody recognizes him. A lot of these people that work at these stadiums have worked there their whole lives. They remember him from when he was a player. And it's really fascinating to watch the genuine respect and admiration they have for him. And usually it's not because of the feats on the field. It's because they remember things like his sportsmanship, his attitude, his approach to the game, its mannerisms. I think those are the things that, of course, people remember, when he threw 6 touchdowns in the Super Bowl and stuff, but it's the personal stuff with Steve that people cling to for a long time. And to be able to kind of trace back through some of these stadiums and see these things has been a fascinating thing for me to watch.
New York Times bestselling author Jeff Benedict. You can read more at jeffbenedict.com. 10,000 Spirals is the blog he just released on Steve Young and his journey at BYU. Really good stuff. So good that we want to read all of it, Jeff. And that's my next question is, how do we get our hands on this? Is this even going to be published?
Well, I don't know. I mean, that's really up to Steve and really up to Steve and his family. That it's a personal decision. He hired me to do something specific, and that's what I did. I mean, he's not the first person to do that, and it was a great thing for me to help him do that. To write his life in a narrative form. He has it. What he does with it from here is his call, it's really a question for him.
I want the book, Jeff. And so I'm going to call him and tell him I want the book. And I'm going to get all of his old buddies to call him and tell him we want the book. So there you go.
Well, that's great. I think it's great that he put this excerpt out because it's a good revealing look at him from a point in his life when he wasn't Steve Young, the superstar. This was a guy who was clawing and scratching and uncertain and nervous and all those things that frankly lots of guys his age and girls experience early on in their life, and it's a window into how he dealt with it, and I think that's what makes it pretty compelling.
It's amazing to be able to relate with things like that. Like, oh, wait, he's not a superhero. He's a real human being who has real struggles, and this is how he overcame that. And I think that's really enlightening and refreshing for people to look into, and just another reason why we all want to read the book. One thing I have noticed about Steve Young and talking with him, Jeff, the times that I have met him and interviewed him here on BYU Sports Nation, is his absolute loyalty to BYU. He is ingrained in what BYU football is and about and the future of it. How connected to the Cougars and the football program is Steve Young right now, being as busy as he is?
Oh, I think, as connected as any other alumni, and probably more so than most. I mean, this guy, if you look at just the year 1980, which is when this excerpt takes place that we put up today, think about that time in BYU sports history. Jim McMahon, Steve Young, and Danny Ainge all on the campus at the same time, not to mention guys like Bart Oates and Tom Homo and Vi Sekahema and Trevor Matich, all these guys who went on to have really good pro careers. But arguably, the two biggest stars to make it as pros were Danny Ainge and Steve Young. And I think that is, to me, like if I were going to identify a golden era in BYU sports, it's the early 80s. I mean, that is when they did things that people look back with like, wow, now that was the glory days. And Steve was in the middle of all that. And I think, obviously he loves BYU, but all you have to do is look at the impact he's had on so many other players who have come through the program since then, the quarterbacks, but not just quarterbacks, guys like Ziggy, Ansah, or other players that Steve, quietly helps and talks to. And I think BYU did great things for him, and obviously he's done great things for BYU.
I love, Jeff, that you mentioned the early 80s. People that weren't around, I always tell them that was like the Camelot. That's Camelot of BYU sports, with what was going on with basketball, what was going on with football at the time. And then baseball, people forget that that's the Wally Joyner and Corey Snyder era, and BYU was ranked in the top 5 in baseball. It was a magic time, and the bright, shining star coming out of all of that. With as great as BYU was and so many different things, Steve Young just rises right to the top of that list of people that have not only done a great job while they were here, but have represented BYU in a tremendous way for years after that.
Yeah, and I say this in all honesty because I take a lot of criticism from Utah fans who think I'm a big BYU homer guy, but the truth is when that era was going on, I was not a BYU fan, and in fact didn't like BYU at all. But the thing I did like was I loved watching Steve and Danny, and they were just so entertaining and so exceptional in their performances that it was impossible not to like them. And then particularly when they got into the pros with the Celtics and the 49ers, it's great. But I think there's no question that was the era for BYU. I mean, you can always look back to that and think about not only the great players, but those games that were won at the buzzer and stuff. They're amazing.
Read more at jeffbenedict.com. Jeff, it's always nice to have you on the program. We appreciate the insight into Steve Young in a light that we've never seen him, and we can hope and pray that he will share the rest with us.
And we'll also do our best to influence. So thanks so much, Jeff, for being with us. This is awesome.
Hey, thanks, guys. It's always a privilege to be on the show with you.
Jeff Benedict, Sports Illustrated contributor and New York Times best-selling author, released the blog 10,000 Spirals. We have tweeted it out on our account at BYU Sports Nation. Take a look.